Thank you for joining today's webinar. We will be starting in just a few moments. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Forecasts Hazy for State Marijuana Tax Revenue. My name is Mandy Rafel, and I'm a Program Director in the Fiscal Affairs Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I will be serving as a webinar moderator. As a reminder, if at any time during this webinar you have difficulty hearing the audio through your computer speakers, please use your telephone to dial in for the audio portion. This webinar will be recorded and archived. You can also download a PDF version of today's webinar slide deck at the top right tab above the PowerPoint. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trust to bring this webinar to you. In case you're not familiar with NCSL, we're a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staffs of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. Our primary mission is to strengthen state legislatures. To fulfill that mission, we provide several services, including research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. Our next big convening is coming up in December. It's our annual Capitol Forum, December 10th through the 13th in Phoenix, Arizona. The forum is an opportunity for members to help develop the state's agenda, get context and analysis on critical issues facing state legislatures, and network with legislators and legislative staff from around the country. The way that states develop NCSL's policy agenda is through participation in one of our 9 standing committees. The issue of marijuana taxation falls within the jurisdiction of NCSL's Committee on Budgets and Revenues. The standing committees meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit every summer and the December Capitol Forum. For more information on these meetings or NCSL activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at ncsl.org. This jointly sponsored webinar will discuss challenges forecasting state marijuana tax revenue. We'll start with Pew expert Adam Levin, who is a senior associate on the tax incentives team for the Pew Charitable Trust. He focuses on issues impacting state and local health, including debt management and fiscal monitoring. He will discuss key research findings and trends from Pew's new report on marijuana tax revenues. Then we'll hear from Josh Lehner, a senior economist at the Office of Economic Analysis for the state of Oregon. Josh will share procedures and insights from Oregon's marijuana forecasting experience. After we hear from our presenters, we will open the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box. The Q&A box is the blue box that says Ask a Question. Use that and not the one below it that says Audience Chat. We will take as many questions as possible within the time we have available. The discussion portion of the webinar will be led by Grace Jensen-Moran. And at this point, I will turn the program over to Adam. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks, Mandy, and thank you to NCSL for hosting this webinar. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Adam Levin, and I'm with the state's Fiscal Health Project at the Pew Charitable Trusts. To share some brief background about Pew and our project team, Pew is a nonprofit, independent public policy organization. The state's Fiscal Health Project researches fiscal and economic conditions and practices across the country. Today, I'm excited to discuss the findings of our new report, Forecasts Hazy for State Marijuana Revenue. In this report, we highlight three key ideas. We examine some of the challenges states face when forecasting revenue from legalized recreational marijuana. These challenges are largely due to the fact that the market is new and there is little data forecasters can rely on. This new research also explores the trends in marijuana tax collections to date, which have shown unpredictable growth. We conclude with a recommendation for policymakers. With the uncertainty around this new source, be cautious when budgeting marijuana revenue. To best manage the uncertainty, states should use the tax dollars for savings or one-time expenses rather than ongoing programs. Legalized recreational marijuana has been an emerging new revenue source across the U.S. 11 states plus D.C. have legalized recreational marijuana. Most recently, Illinois passed legislation effective January 1st, 2020. So far, marijuana products are sold and taxed in 7 of those states. But forecasting revenue from a product that was uniformly illegal just a few years ago, and remains so under federal law, presents a unique challenge for state budget planning. The biggest hurdle for states has been a lack of reliable data. For other excise taxes, such as those on alcohol or cigarettes, forecasters can draw on decades of data. Legal recreational marijuana, on the other hand, has only been sold in states since 2014, and even Colorado and Washington, the first states to legalize, are trying to understand more about the market. With more states considering legalization, including New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York, forecasting and budgeting difficulties are likely to become more widespread. The structure of a state's marijuana tax affects how much revenue is generated. Typically, states have levied an excise tax, which is specific to marijuana, and the state's general sales tax, if one exists. The excise tax has been applied at both the cultivator, or the grower, level and the retail level, and can be based on the price or quantity of the good. You can find the details of each state's tax structure in our report. Data on marijuana tax collections to date show that revenue has increased from year to year, typically growing at the quickest pace in the first couple of years. Washington collected the most revenue in fiscal year 2018, about $420 million, which surpassed excise tax revenue from both cigarettes and alcohol. However, there is evidence that this growth tapers significantly as markets mature. This figure shows total marijuana revenue in Washington, one of the 2 states with the oldest markets, from fiscal year 2015 through 2018. We can see that while the rate of growth was 277% from 2015 to 2016, it slowed to 17% by 2018. States have encountered a range of difficulty with forecasting marijuana revenue, especially near introduction. In Nevada's first 6 months of collecting marijuana taxes, revenue is 40% higher than forecasted. In contrast, California's revenue is 45% below the state's initial $1 billion projection in the first 6 months of collections. While the numbers really varied across the states, forecasters faced a lot of the same challenges. The main challenge has been a lack of historical data on the various factors that affect forecasting, some of which are unique to legalized recreational marijuana. Especially at the start, forecasters faced difficulties estimating demand for recreational marijuana and the degree of use, determining product price, and understanding other market factors that add uncertainty to revenue estimates. I'll go into detail about each of these factors in the next few slides. Estimating use and demand is a big part of developing marijuana revenue forecasts, but getting reliable information has been difficult. There were few existing resources forecasters used to make their estimates, including the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, which is a federal survey that's broken down by state. Some states also commissioned state-specific research. While these resources were the best available to use as starting points, they posed potential issues. Forecasters felt that surveys asking about an activity that was illegal at the time may have led some respondents to misrepresent their usage. It was also unclear how much usage might increase with legalization. On the demand side, there were questions about product popularity. Besides marijuana flower, dispensaries sell edibles, extracts, and other products with varying THC content and prices, which directly affect revenue. And consumer preferences for these products are already shifting. For example, edibles and concentrates are increasing in popularity. Another big demand question is about conversion from the medical and black markets to the legal recreational one. Legal prices tend to be higher because of licensing, taxes, testing, and fees, which may affect the number of consumers moving from the illicit market to the legal market. The California Cannabis Advisory Committee, for example, found that the state's legal marijuana market has not presented an attractive alternative to the black market, in large part due to higher prices. This may be one reason why California's revenue was initially below forecasts. The largely untaxed medical marijuana market could interact with the legal recreational market in similar ways. Since most states tax marijuana on price, determining how much it sells for is also key. Colorado and other early adopting states used medical prices as a proxy initially. Later adopting states looked to prices in already existing markets. Prices in most states spiked initially when supply was scarce, but have since declined. The question is, how low will prices ultimately go? Have states reached to that point, and how will forecasters know? There's also prices' indirect effect on revenue, which adds to the uncertainty. When prices fall, for example, state revenue will decline unless there is an offsetting boost in sales. Research on how price changes influence demand for marijuana is still developing. Other market factors can influence revenue collections and projections. For example, it takes time for businesses to get licensed and operational. It also takes time for seeds to mature and get to sale after businesses start up. Some states also require local governments to decide on and implement regulations. All of these factors affect how much supply is in the market. States didn't always account for these in making their initial forecasts. Other complications when trying to gauge tax collections are competition from neighboring states and the slice of revenue generated by visitors. Nevada attributed above forecast sales partially to stronger than expected tourist sales in Las Vegas. When Oregon had legalized but not yet set up shops, it saw some sales flow into Washington state. This dynamic will likely be even more pronounced on the East Coast, where big cities are much closer together and is something states should keep in mind. Forecasting challenges and a lack of data have made legalized recreational marijuana a highly unpredictable revenue source. But policymakers can manage this uncertainty by budgeting the revenue in careful ways. Some states already implement good practices. One is to direct the money towards savings. Nevada has contributed proceeds from its retail excise tax to its rainy day fund. A second practice is to budget the tax dollars after they are collected. Colorado and California divert the revenue to a separate fund and then use the money in the following year. Similar to other excise taxes, like those on cigarettes, that depend heavily on consumer behavior, states should not assume that revenue from legalized recreational marijuana will be reliable in the long term. Given the uncertainty, policymakers should be cautious about dedicating marijuana revenue to ongoing spending to help ensure future budget balance. Now I'll turn it over to Josh, after which we will address any questions you may have.
All right. Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here and to give a little maybe perspective on, what we're seeing out here in Oregon and some of the issues we've come up with. And so I brought a few things today to discuss, and happy to answer any questions following this that you may have. But I thought I'd start with a little bit on the timeline and the process. Our office of Economic Analysis, we do most of the economic and revenue forecasting for the state. We've been doing that, since the inception of our office. However, that wasn't true with marijuana. When marijuana first came, both to Oregon as a ballot measure, where the citizens voted to approve legal recreational marijuana, our office was not involved. And even after we first began sales, our office was not involved. The forecasting responsibilities laid with the Department of Revenue and the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, the regulating body. However, after 6 to 12 months of that, the legislature did take away the forecasting responsibilities and give it to us. And there's a number of things that went into that discussion. So I think if your city or county or state is thinking about legalizing, I think it'd be important to think through the process in which you would want to regulate the industry and also forecast the revenue and budget at the same time. Now, the fact that we came in a year later or a year after the fact of legal sales beginning made our job entirely easier than it was for those that were doing it before us, because we had a year of sales and we had 2 or 3 years of data coming from Washington and from Colorado. So it was a lot easier to try and gauge it, whereas if you're starting from scratch at the very beginning before you have any data whatsoever, you're really just trying to right size the market and right size the estimates to get as best you can forecast of the revenue. So our job was made immensely easier by coming in later in the process. Now, why were we brought into the process? A lot of it has to do with, not only do we do revenue forecasting of other types, but we also have a forecast process that we use. Oregon, unlike a lot of other states, we're a one forecast state. We don't have competing forecasts where people go into a room and hammer out their differences and come up with a consensus number that way. We do our consensus work on the front end where we have advisory groups. We meet with them regularly, at least once a quarter, if not more frequently than that, where we get everyone in a room together or on the phone and discuss our issues up front. And then we turn that discussion into a one revenue forecast that is used in budget perspective. And so we set up a marijuana forecast advisory group, similar to what we've done for our other types of forecasts. That includes all the state agencies that touch the marijuana industry or receive the money or regulate it, including the local folks, the cities and the counties, as they have to deal with the boots on the ground impact of regulating the industry and nuisance complaints and all that sort of stuff. And then we bring in private sector folks to the best we can. And this has been our biggest challenge. We've had a few private sector individuals come and go over the course of these meetings over the last 2 years. But we have one individual who's basically a marijuana consultant, a business consultant that specializes in cannabis these days. He's always there, and he's always been an assistance to our office to help us understand some of those, private sector business dynamics that are out there. And so having all these people around the table has been quite helpful just to make sure we're all on the same page. We're all looking at the data the same way. We can hear from the Department of Revenue, say we have this compliance issue or we had a processing backlog. And so the revenue numbers last month were down, not because people weren't paying, but because, Jill was sick or her kid got sick or whatever the case may be. And it'll just help ensure that we're all on the same page. We do a quarterly forecast. We update it every 3 months and release it to the legislature. On the marijuana, we are updating it every 3 months like our other forecast. However, we're really only doing it every 6 months. We're convening that advisory group every 6 months instead of every 3 months, just because it's a new program. We're not really looking to change that outlook dramatically because it's such a new thing. We're still not fully sure what the underlying trends and impacts of the sales and all the other stuff that's going on is. And so we don't want to, let 1 or 2 months of data really wag the dog when it comes to that long-term forecast over a multi-year period. And so we're really trying to keep the forecast anchored to a reasonable expectation, and then we're just truing up actual sales on a monthly or a quarterly basis to allow for the revenue picture to reflect that we had a couple strong months or a couple weak months, but our underlying outlook is probably the same unless we're hearing otherwise from our advisory group. In the big picture, just thinking about it, if your states are thinking about legalizing marijuana, the first thing we did was turn and look at the experience of other states. And this is just 2 charts showing recreational marijuana sales in some of the early states. The graph on the left is the actual sales, right? Taking monthly tax collections, you divide by the tax rate, that gets you the total amount of sales that were sold in the state. And of course, the numbers vary over time, and they vary by the state given the size. And so on the right, the chart on the right, all I've done is adjust by the size of the adult population. I made everything on an Oregon basis. So, Colorado's numbers on an Oregon basis and Washington numbers on an Oregon basis, just to help with a frame of reference to compare our sales to what some of these other states are seeing. And then another thing I did is I lined it up from the start date, from the very first month of when the programs or legal sales began, because we see this initial ramp-up period for at least the first few years, if not longer, right? We're still seeing ramp-ups in Colorado. We think we're still seeing ramp-ups here in year 3 in Oregon, and you can kind of see some of the differences across the states based upon usage rates and sales data and the tourism component, as Adam was mentioning, and a lot of other things going on. But this at least gives you a pretty good apples to apples look to what sales are, at least in those initial years. And I suspect a lot of your other states out there are going to look really similar to this too, once you adjust for tax rates and usage and what have you. Given it's a new topic, it's a new industry, it's a new revenue stream for the public agencies and the public bodies, what do we think about the outlook moving forward? We know there's a ton of issues and risks that are out there. There's issues and risks from a regulatory point of view, from a business point of view. We always have the specter of the federal government ramping up enforcement on a Schedule I drug and not letting the states do as they may, so to speak, particularly if leakages or the outflows of marijuana from a legal state into the illegal state continues to be a problem for law enforcement and the like. And so there's a lot of risks that abound. And this is a slide or topics that we regularly discuss with our advisory groups and with legislators and the like to talk about the uncertainty regarding this new revenue stream and this brand new industry or this brand new legal industry within the state. A lot of the things really boil down to the demand side when we think about the underlying revenue growth and the sales growth. Is we assume the businesses and the private sector will take care of the supply side. Now, there's bottlenecks when it comes to permitting, when it comes to getting applications through the door and processing them quickly enough, and maybe bad weather will ruin an outdoor harvest crop like we had a couple years ago. And like, there's a lot of things that go on there. But underlying that, if we talk to all the folks in other states, after a year or two, for sure, the supply side's kind of figured out. In fact, we're more worried about oversupply. There's too many businesses producing marijuana relative to that local demand. And that local demand component where the local sales are occurring is really the hardest thing here to properly gauge, because we don't have good data. As Adam was saying, we have some surveys that are done every year. For lack of a better word, you can roll your own estimates. You can use these surveys to look at, what share of the population consumes marijuana on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. How much do they typically consume in a given setting? And you can come up with this ballpark estimate of what total marijuana consumed in your state would be. And then you start segmenting it from there. Then you start saying, well, what's the black market? What's the medical market? What's this recreational market? And the like. And so those really harder things to know about the black market conversion, where we're shrinking the black market and growing the legal market, is entirely unknown. You have to kind of triangulate it and back into it the best that you can, given this imperfect data that you have. And right now, just as a heads up or the information, in Oregon, we're estimating that the legal recreational marijuana market is about 55% of the total marijuana market, right? That's either a big number or a little number, depending upon how you want to look at it. In one respect, that's a little number. That means there's 45% of marijuana that's, that is split about 50-50 between medical and the black market. So the black market is still 25% of all marijuana sales in Oregon. That seems to be a big number. However, at the same time, the legal market, the legal recreational market, used to be zero. So in 2 years or 2.5 years, we've gone from 0% legal recreational sales to over half of the market. So a lot of progress is being made, but it's imperfect. And again, it's a little bit of a back of the envelope calculations. One of the biggest issues when it comes to the revenue forecast itself, and a lot of you will laugh at this, but is the price component, right? In Oregon, we're not a sales tax state, so we don't think about prices a lot in the terms of revenue forecast. But all you retail sales tax states, this, that with the couches and TVs and cars, those big ticket durable goods, they're actually getting cheaper over time. We're having retail deflation where the prices are going down, and so you're getting less revenue for every purchase made over time. Well, we're seeing the exact same thing here in the marijuana industry, and so this is something we've thought quite a lot about in the last couple of years and really tried to ingrain into our forecast, where marijuana prices in the last 2 years in the state of Oregon have plunged by at least 50%, maybe 60% in a lot of ways. And so even if consumers are buying the same number of ounces or pounds or the same number of joints or edibles or whatever the case may be, because that's the amount they use on a daily or monthly basis, we're getting less and less tax revenue for every item sold because the price is going down and we levy the tax based on price. So that retail deflation is no different in marijuana than it is for other industries. It's just something new for us to consider out here. And these charts try and show you that, where the average price for both usable marijuana, so that's like the flower and the bud that is generally smoked, is down 50%, and the edibles and the concentrates and the extracts are also down by the same amount. But our tax revenue continued to go up because that underlying quantity sold continued to go up by 200 or 300% or up to 500% on the edibles and the extracts and concentrates. So we're getting a normal response in the marketplace. Marijuana appears to be a normal good, which means as the price goes down, the quantity consumed goes up. The ultimate question is, how high will that consumption rate go? How high will sales eventually go after the ramp-up period is over? And if we look across the country, some of these surveys of drug use, they're all continuing to show increases across nearly all states. I think South Carolina showed a decline, but all the other 49 states showed an increase over this decade period. And Oregon's now number one. It's important to keep in mind that this is surveyed usage rates. This is the number of your residents in your state willing to admit to federal survey takers that, yes, I consume a federally illegal drug. It is not a perfect measure of usage. It is just basically the one that we have available consistently over time periods. And so we're showing that usage is going up. And so therefore, how high will it go is a really good question. And we don't know. Right now, marijuana usage in Oregon is equal to tobacco usage in Oregon in terms of these usage rates on a regular basis at around 20%. I think our smoking rate is at 16%, and then we have a 4% smokeless tobacco rate too. How high will that go? Right now, 60% of Americans and 60% of Oregonians admit that they use alcohol on a regular basis. So if marijuana continues to go all the way up to where alcohol usage is and social acceptance of alcohol is, then really these marijuana forecasts will continue to increase quite dramatically over the ensuing decade or so as usage and social acceptance increases. However, our forecast doesn't call for that. We're not expecting that. We don't have an explicit usage rate built into our forecast, but we have some more of it continuing to increase as sales increase and population growth increases and the like. Another concern that you hear quite a bit about within the industry and policymakers and law enforcement and the like is leakages outside of the system, right? Where people maybe are a legalized recreational grower, they comply with regulatory checks and all that stuff, but then at the end of the day, maybe they leak some of their product onto the black market or out of state or whatever the case may be. And one concern is that maybe the market becomes too saturated, where the competition for consumer sales is so high and so dramatic that those leakages increase as firms don't want to go out of business. They need to make money any way they can. And so we're really seeing it here in Oregon relative to Colorado and Washington, where the number of retailers certainly seems like we're much more saturated than these other states, where we have more stores. Not only do we have more marijuana retailers overall than these other two states that are much bigger than us, we're a small state. So on a population adjusted basis, we're really significantly outnumbering them. And this goes for other product types too. You can see the bullet point on the right. We have 2,200 licensed recreational marijuana companies in the state. That's all types. The retailers are 600 or so, and then we have maybe 1,200 wholesalers and growers and what have you. But there's another 1,500 in the pipeline. They've submitted the application, maybe they paid for the application, they're just waiting for approval and to enter into the industry. So the saturation and increased competition on the business side of things is real. Now is it a real problem? I'm not so sure that it's a problem from a macroeconomic sense. It's great for consumers. All this competition has really driven down the price of marijuana. It's never been a better time in the state of Oregon to consume or purchase marijuana, which is great for individuals. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily a problem overall. There's going to be winners and losers in any market, particularly a new one. It's going to have a shakeout, and we're going to see increased consolidation, right? With all this competition and the saturation, we're starting to see a couple firms go out of business, but not a ton, but we're starting to see buyouts and mergers and acquisitions, and that's going to continue to happen until some sort of stable equilibrium in the market is reached. And I don't think we're there yet. Even here in our third year, we're certainly not there yet. Time will tell exactly how far it takes to reach that. And what does that bottom line look like when it comes to what a normal industry and concentration and level of sales looks like? We'll see. And so far, Oregon policymakers have basically taken a much more laissez-faire type perspective to these transitions, these changes than other states. We're not capping the number of licenses so much. Now we have put in a moratorium on new ones, given we have 1,500 applicants in the pipeline. They're no longer accepting new applicants for a while or for some period of time, but we're not capping the overall number of businesses as some other states are doing. Longer term, thinking about what are the economic and revenue benefits of legalizing marijuana, a couple things spring to mind. One is this is a new revenue stream for all of us. It diversifies your revenue stream, so it makes it more stable over the business cycle because it's a consumption style tax, particularly relative to income taxes, which are more volatile, both personal and corporate. It's not a game changer, however, right? We're getting about $100 million in state revenue a year, which is great. Policymakers never had that $100 million in resources for our state before, so they're able to do things with it. However, when in the context of a $21 billion general fund in the state of Oregon or a $60 or $70 billion all funds budget, an extra $100 million a year doesn't really change the big picture perspective. I always get these questions when I go around the state and we talk about this is like, why are we cutting, teachers? Why are the classrooms getting larger and schools struggling with finances? Don't we have all this weed money to backfill it? And it's like, well, the challenges with state budgets are not masked over by a little bit of additional revenue, even if it is new additional revenue. It helps, but it doesn't cure anything, so to speak. And on the economic side, we've added a lot of jobs in our vice industries here in the state of Oregon. We've added about 6,000 payroll jobs in marijuana firms. These are jobs that are covered by the unemployment insurance system. So these are, regulated, legalized positions. They're getting a W-2, and so to speak, and they're covered by unemployment insurance. We know there's a lot of seasonal and temporary work around harvest time, so maybe at the peak, we're talking more like 14,000 new jobs in the state of Oregon, which is a lot of jobs. That's a tremendous increase here. However, all these jobs are agricultural and retail related, so they're very low wage, they're part-time, they're not necessarily good jobs, so to speak. And really, the economic impact will come if we can develop things beyond agriculture and retail. Higher wages will come with more value-added manufacturing, turning into oils and extracts and creams and things like that. And developing a broader cluster. Maybe you have new lab testing equipment. Maybe you have new firms that make greenhouses or the HVAC systems that get installed with grow operations and things like that, right? That broader cluster of ancillary industries will really be where the true economic impact comes from. It won't come from the growing and the selling of the product because, again, there's a lot of low-wage, part-time type jobs. And so we really hope for an economic perspective, we get more than that. To date, not so much. We don't see a ton of that, but we're hoping longer term it will continue to evolve and develop and provide benefits. In terms of the next steps for our office, we're going to continue to monitor the data. The monthly sales and tax receipts as they come in, the annual surveys as we get them. We reconvene our advisory group every 6 months and update our forecast accordingly if we need to. And eventually, we want to build a full-fledged econometric model. Right now, again, we're kind of pegging our growth to things seen in Oregon, or excuse me, seen in Washington and Colorado, adjusted for a couple different things. But eventually, we want to build a real model that uses sort of our economic model, maybe our demographic model as inputs and drivers into our marijuana forecast, like we do for our other ones, for our revenue models and our lottery forecasts and things like that, where we're using our products already existing off the shelf from our office and factoring those in to the marijuana forecast. But we're still in this initial ramp-up period, and it'll be, once we settle down and marijuana is a normal good and the share of the population that consumes it stabilizes and things like that, that'll be really when we can turn this into a normal type of forecast. But in these initial years, we're still not there. And in talking with our counterparts in Oregon and Washington and Colorado, excuse me, they're not necessarily there either, in just chatting with them and how they're thinking about it. And so with that, that's everything I brought with me today in prepared remarks. Adam and I and NCSL are happy to answer any questions that you may have. As always, here's my contact information. Please reach out. Feel free to call me, send me an email if you wish to discuss this further in the future. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Josh. Let's get started with the Q&A portion here. I'm Grace Jensen-Moran, a member of the communications team at the Pew Charitable Trust. Our experts and presenters, Adam Levin and Josh Lehner, will be taking your questions. If you'd like to direct a question to one of them, please specify when submitting. As a reminder, you'll be submitting your questions in the blue box that says Ask a Question at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many questions of yours as we can, but please feel free to follow up with any of us or me at gjensenmoran@pewtrust.org. The PowerPoint from today, including a link to the reports and the materials, will be on the NCSL website as well. So let's get started with your questions. First question here we have relates to longer-term expectations from revenue, and I'm going to direct this one to Adam. Longer term, why would we expect revenue from marijuana to be more volatile than revenue from tobacco or alcohol?
Well, I wouldn't say that we would expect it to be more volatile. Alcohol and tobacco taxes can be unpredictable too, often are unpredictable. They generally rely on increased tax rates or increased consumption to grow in the long term. The difference with marijuana is that there's not a backstory. There's no data to look at, so we don't know how it's behaved, as opposed to with alcohol and tobacco, where you have decades of data to look at. That's just not the case for marijuana, so that sort of merits the increased caution that policymakers should use with marijuana taxes.
Excellent. Okay, next question here we have for Adam as well. You suggested that we were talking about the cost of marijuana. How do you factor in the cost of marijuana, such as beefed up enforcement, instances of hospitalizations, into the budgeting discussions? Do you consider the financial ramifications ahead, or do you factor in any losses after the fact?
Well, we do see a number of states putting at least a portion of the revenue from marijuana taxes towards the cost of implementing their legalized recreational marijuana programs. So it is something that some states are thinking about, at least. Josh, do you have anything else to add on that budgeting aspect?
We're one of the states that we are spending out of current money, so we're not doing the 1-year delay like some other states. They switched that to be able to spend the money sooner. The other thing I was going to say along those lines is gosh, I just lost it for whatever reason. Sorry.
All right.
I'm totally spaced. I apologize.
No worries. I have actually another question for you, Josh, while you're on that. When it comes to the black market, you suggested that black market share has decreased since marijuana was legalized, but what would you say about the size of the market prior to legalization? How big was the illegal market prior to legalization?
The back of the envelope suggested it was roughly, 75%. So we've gone from 75% black market, 25% medical, to 50% recreational, 25% black, 25% medical, in very broad strokes. Again, these are imperfect estimates.
And I have another question here for Josh. Did Oregon or other states consider new users in your initial or subsequent forecasts? For example, market penetration to users who report in the surveys that they've never used marijuana.
Implicitly, we have that built into our forecast, right? If you try and back out, so again, we're doing a forecast. Our forecast is for top line revenue to the state. That is what we're forecasting. And if you start with that and you look at our numbers and you try and back them out, some of those underlying components, maybe we have usage rates. Implicitly, we're implying usage rates in Oregon are going to go from 20% where they are today to maybe closer to 30% over the next decade, right? So we have some of that built in. As some of those very initial projections, I think it'd be important to keep in mind that the survey numbers are also imperfect, but I think it would be reasonable to have it increasing. So I think you'd have to build some of that in. How much and how quickly you would do that, that's certainly the imperfect part of it. That's the art, not the science.
Got it. Thanks, Josh. We have another question for Adam here. For the first few states that legalized, how are those revenue expectations set without other states to look toward?
States had a difficult time doing it. Like Josh was saying, it was definitely an art rather than a science, more of an art, at least at the beginning. But like I mentioned earlier, there were surveys that were commissioned. There was the federal survey on drug use and health, which breaks down usage by state for various substances. So states used that as a starting point. There were also a few state-specific surveys and research projects that were done to try and estimate the size of the market. And then, so that was how they started at the beginning. And then communication among the early adopting states also helped set expectations at the very beginning.
All right, another question for Josh here. How is Oregon using its revenues? And if not for general operations, is there a point where the legislative or executive branch will turn to it for regular budget needs?
It is being used for regular budget needs. Right now, the allocations are, if I get this right, 40% for K through 12 education, 10% to cities, 10% to counties, 20% to state police. 20, 40, that gives you 80. The other 20% is to human services. There's a couple different places, whether it's mental health or addictions or what have you. So basically, it's 40% education, 20% state police, 20% cities and counties, and 20% human services. The other thing I'd mention, I remember what I spaced on earlier. When it comes to the budget perspective, we have something called the kicker law in Oregon. You guys may be unfamiliar with that. No other state has anything like this. It's basically where when we mess up our revenue forecast by more than 2%, that excess revenue above the initial forecast, not the money that above the 2%, but all of the money above the initial forecast is returned to taxpayers. At least our general fund revenues. It's a very tight lid on forecast errors. And so both the initial ballot measure and the legislators since then have made sure that we have set up the marijuana fund as separate and distinct from the general fund, so that marijuana revenue is not subject to the kicker laws and returning it to taxpayers like our personal income taxes and things like that. So making sure that it was a distinct fund, is a win from a budgeting perspective and an administrative policy.
Excellent. So we have one more for both of you. I'll kick it to Adam first. Have any of your recreational cannabis states experienced revenue cannibalization from other sin tax revenue sources, primarily alcohol?
I think that it's too early to say for sure whether there has been a cannibalization effect with other sin tax revenue. It's certainly something that forecasters are thinking about when they're doing their marijuana tax forecasts. Josh, do you have something to add on that?
I do. I agree that it's too early. There's research on both sides, right? And there's research from people that I know and believe to be trustworthy people that show both, whether it's on the beer side it is impacting or not impacting or what have you. I think over the long run it's impossible that they don't, right? Because if they don't, you're saying that the people who consume alcohol or the people that play lottery games or people that go to sporting events are entirely distinct from the people who consume marijuana. And I think an assumption along those lines is absurd, right? They're the same people to a certain degree. Those populations overlap, and so there will be some cannibalization from other household entertainment products, whether it's alcohol or gambling or sporting events or going out to the movies or whatever the case may be, as household budgets can only be stretched so far. So there will be some cannibalization, particularly as that usage rates increases and we get new users. Maybe initially there's not a lot of cannibalization because these people were already spending a decent amount of money on marijuana just in the black market. But as we get the legal market up and running, we get more users switching over or consuming marijuana for the first time in years or first time ever, then it's going to have to come out of somewhere, and it's going to come out of other segments of your entertainment budget. So there will be cannibalization at some point.
Lovely. All right, I have another question for Josh here. Do you have thoughts about the future of marijuana taxation in terms of tax structure design, given the volatility of marijuana prices and consumer preference?
I will say Oregon started with, not exactly, but something more closer to Alaska's current system, right? Where we were levying a tax based upon per plant or per bud or whatever the case may be, right? It was more on a per unit basis, and scrapped that due to complexity and some discussions between policymakers and the business folks, and moved to basically just a sales tax. And it's so much easier to administer and understand and what have you. Now, in terms of the impact moving forward, I think we've seen the biggest moves already in the rearview mirror, right? I think in discussing with some folks and talking to some growers and industry people, prices can go down another 50%, right? But another 50% from today's vantage point is a smaller change than the 50% decline we've already seen, right? Going from $8 a gram on the retail price to $4 a gram is a bigger impact than going from $4 a gram to $2 a gram, right? That shift is half the size, even though it's the same percentage decline, it's still half the size. And so I think most of that price impact is in the rearview mirror. It doesn't mean it won't be an issue going forward, and we have some of that built in to our forecast. Implicitly in our forecast is that prices will continue to decline, although actual price data in the last 6 months show that that's not the case. Prices have been flattening out for the last 6 months. So in that sense, that's an upside risk to revenue because prices aren't declining like we thought they might.
All right, we have another question here for both of you, but I'll kick it to Josh first. Given how Oregon uses its revenue, is there any concern about the sustainability of the revenues, whether that will cause budget management problems, or are the dollars small enough that it's not a major concern?
I think both, and just talking with the budget shop and what have you, I think it's both. There's always ongoing concerns. They have an ending balance of a small degree within the marijuana fund, but not a huge one. And so I think you always face that challenge of not having enough cushion, but at the same time, at least from today's vantage point, with our reserve funds and our general fund ending balance and things like that, there's plenty of wiggle room to backfill these obligations if we need to. The other thing that they have done from a budgetary perspective, and this is something that our legislature has been doing in the last 6 years in particular, is while I said there's those allocations, 40%, 20%, 10%, and what have you, That's just the big picture statutory language, but they have the authority to fix those allocations, right? So they can say, initially we're going to give you 40% of this revenue, but then in the budget bill itself, they give the dollar amount, and then they fix that dollar amount. So if revenues come in above expectation, that just goes to the ending balance to build up a little bit more of a cushion. And if the money comes in lower than expected, then they'll have to go in and true that up or backfill it. So they've tried to build in a little more flexibility into the way they do this, and they do this with our lottery funds too. But it's not a true reserve fund or anything like that.
And if I could just add on, even though generally the dollars from marijuana taxes are a small portion of states' budget in the states that have legalized recreational marijuana, when the money is put towards recurring programs, things like education spending or health spending that needs to be that happens every year, I think there can be a concern that those monies might be unsustainable, and so we would recommend that policymakers just be cautious when they're using marijuana tax dollars in that way. Using it on things like one-time spending, like capital spending on schools, for example, might be a better use than ongoing education spending.
Great. Okay, I have the next question for Adam here. Where have states directed their marijuana dollars? Are there specific trends you're seeing on the expenditure side?
Yeah, so states direct their marijuana tax dollars to a variety of places. Like we've talked about, some states do direct it towards their general fund. We also see some states that have set up specific marijuana funds. We are seeing one thing that we do see is a number of states using it for drug treatment, drug education, and health programs, also using it to cover the cost of their legalized recreational marijuana program. And then, like I was alluding to earlier, we do see some states using it for things like education, transportation, things like that. And those are the types of areas where if it's being used on recurring spending, policymakers may just want to take caution in thinking about how they're allocating these dollars.
Love it. So one more question for Josh here. Oregon ran into a backlog of applications from businesses looking to grow and sell marijuana when the industry was starting up. Can you talk about that and any impact that it had on revenue, as well as ways that the state tried to deal with the backlog?
In terms of the administrative side, just hire as many people as you can to try and work through that over at the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, the regulatory body that oversees the industry, along with the liquor industry, of course. And I don't know a ton about that. I know it was a huge challenge. It continues to be a huge challenge, and that's why we have the moratorium on new applications. From the beginning, they knew this was going to be some challenges, and from the beginning, they knew they didn't want to put in some of those more restrictive caps on the number of licenses and the number of firms out there and things like that. They wanted to, it was an active decision to be as hands-off as possible. But we kind of got what we asked for in that respect. Now, what was the impact on revenue? It's a really hard thing to say. We had a clear slowdown in revenue for a few months as we transitioned. So when Oregon started sales, they started what was called early start sales, where you could buy recreational product at a medical dispensary, right? It's the same product, but you didn't have to have a medical marijuana card. You could just go in and say, I'm 21 years old. I'd like to buy some sort of product. And as we transitioned from those medical dispensary sales that were regulated by the medical market to the recreational market, there was a whole lot of things that happened at the same time. There's the bottleneck in applications. There was more stringent testing requirements, so we lost some product that had to get thrown out, or maybe it got diverted to the black market because it didn't meet the health specs for the recreational market and the like. And so we definitely, for the 3-4 months, as we were doing this transition into the full-fledged recreational market, 3 or 4 months of really lackluster sales. But that's been corrected, and it was much more a temporary issue. and not a long-run structural problem. But again, those sort of things matter, because every month where you miss forecast by $1 million, that adds up and has budgetary implications.
All right, last question here for Adam. How accurate have states been in their revenue forecasts?
It has varied. California, in its first 6 months, forecast $1 billion from marijuana tax revenue. The revenue collections came in at about $345 million, so California over-forecast. Nevada, on the other hand, for the same period, forecast revenue collections of about $50 million, and they actually came in closer to $70 million, so they under-forecasted there. Other states, though, have been pretty on the mark. Colorado, in its first year of collections, forecasts, I believe it was $67 million worth of marijuana revenue and collected $66 million, so they were pretty much on the mark there, so it's varied. Josh, anything you'd like to add about the accuracy of Oregon's forecasts so far?
The initial forecasts were wildly off the mark. I can say that because that wasn't my forecast. Since we've taken over, it's been much more accurate. But again, that's not necessarily because of me. That's because of, we were a year into the process and we have these other states to look at. So Oregon's initial projections were way off, but since then we've dialed it in pretty well.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that's the end of the Q&A portion. If we didn't get to your question, I'll follow up with you. Feel free to email me, gjensenmoran@feautres.org, and I'll get your question to Josh or Adam, or feel free to reach out to Emily with that contact information on your screen right now. Just thank you so much to NCSL. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for your interest in this increasingly important research area. And with that, I will kick it back to Mandy.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, this brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. Like Grace said, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at the email address shown on the screen. And just a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and it will be archived on the NCSL website. And one last thing, if you have a minute or two, please share your feedback on this webinar by taking a short survey after it concludes. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much to our partners at Pew, our speakers, Adam and Josh, and a big thank you to all of you in the audience for your interest and participation today.